Alright, we've got a new dresser today. When I picked it up, I noticed there was this spot on the top. Might be water, might be some other kind of spill, I'm not exactly sure, but we're going to get into it and have some fun. So we're going to start like we always do by taking these drawers out. So the drawers are out, now I'm taking the old hardware off. I always replace the hardware on my furniture refinishing. I just feel like if you're going to refinish a dresser, you might as well put new hardware on too. So I'm taking the old hardware off, putting it in a bucket, and then I'm going to put tape over those holes because I like to reuse the original holes. So I'm not drilling new ones, and it saves time on the piece. I'm not going to show me taking the hardware off every single drawer. I'm just going to show a couple here, but basically I'm taking the hardware off all the drawers and I'm taping over all the holes on the drawers. Now we're going to cover these with paper. This is to keep the overspray from going down into the drawers. So I cover the entire drawer with paper and then I tape it off. I'm going to do this with all the drawers, this exact same technique. So just roll your paper out, set your drawer in it, and tape it off on the ends, and flip it over on the other side. Just cut and tape. And I'm going to do this with all the drawers, but I don't think I showed all of them in the video. But just do this with all of them every time. Quick and simple. Now we're sanding these with 120 grit. The goal is to get these down to bare wood and get the old hardware marks out. Usually when the lacquer is still soft, they put the hardware on. So there's always impressions on just about every dresser I refinish. There's impressions from the old hardware, and you have to sand those completely down to bare wood, or they will show through when you put your new hardware on. I guess if you're reusing the old hardware, you probably don't have to sand this hard, but I always replace the hardware, so this is a requirement for me. Here's just another angle at what I'm looking at, and you can see the old impressions from the previous hardware. So I'm hitting these with 120 because I have to get all of those out. So I sped that whole thing up, but I actually did do all of the drawers with 120, and now I'm moving on to 220. And these you don't have to sand as much. The 120 is for hogging off material and getting those cleaned up and smoothed out. The 220 is basically just to close the grain, smooth it up a little bit, so you don't have to sand as hard. So now moving on to the stripping part of the whole process here. I like to get the drawers started and then move on to working on the dresser. Basically, since this is a business now, I've looked for ways to make it more efficient. So usually while the drawers are being worked on, the dresser is drying, or while I'm working on the dresser, the drawers are, drying or they're finished. So I get started on the drawers first, and then I move on to stripping the tops, and that's what I'm doing right now. So I'm using my stripper, and I put a real thick coat on, and I'm just using a chip brush to move it around to cover that whole surface completely. And I like to put on a real thick layer like this. Usually a thin layer will dry out, so thicker the better usually. So now we are going to scrape this off. I think I waited about 5 minutes before getting started on this, but it was cold in my shop and I had three heaters going on high, and it still kind of dried out the stripper more than I wanted. So you'll see here I didn't quite get all of it off, but it's okay, I guess. In the summer when it's warm, I don't usually have to worry about this, but I've got a heater blowing right on it, and that kind of dried out a little bit of that stripper. But I basically just put the stripper on, let it sit for a few minutes, and then I'm using my scraper and this dustpan, and I'm just scraping it into that, and then it goes into the trash. So I got most of it off, and I think I'm going to speed the video up here just because I'm just getting the last little bits that I can. You really want to reduce the amount of sanding you have to do on the top. Now, I got lucky and this happens to be a solid wood top, so I can sand all day and not have to worry about it. But usually I have to deal with veneer, and it's pretty thin, so you don't want to sand very much. So you want to limit the amount of sanding you do, and you want to scrape as much finish off as possible. So here I'm just cleaning up the edge. Edges are the absolute worst when it comes to sanding. They're the fastest to get damaged, so you really want to clean the edges up as much as you can. And now for this trim, I'm using a grout brush, and these are like a couple dollars at Home Depot. These are not the metal bristles, these are the stiff plastic ones. So again, I'm just knocking off as much finish as I can because you want to reduce the amount of sanding. So we're going to clean these edges up. We're going to clean up the trim all around, and then we're going to move on to wiping down with mineral spirits. And you have to use this to neutralize the stripping agent. I just put on a decent amount, and then I just use my rag and spread it around, and I make sure I soak the whole thing down, and then I'll just use a dry rag to wipe off the excess. So here we go, using dry rag to wipe this off. Usually I like to strip and wipe these down towards the evening and then let them dry overnight before I start sanding. But there's days where I just things work out to where I have to strip and sand in the same day. So I'll wipe off the excess and then I'll give it maybe 3 or 4 hours, and then it's dry enough to sand. Now it is day two, and right now the dresser is pretty well dried and ready to go, but I want to get these drawers started here. So while the drawers are drying, I can work on the dresser, and periodically I can pop in and continue with the drawers while I'm working on the dresser with staining or whatever I'm doing there. So I'm using my air gun to clean them out. I wipe them off with a cloth and then I spray them also just to get every possible little bit of dust off. So I only need one coat of primer because the primer I use is really good and pricey, but it's good. So I'm going to give this medium layer of primer, and since it's a primer and sealer that I'm using, I don't have to worry about bleed through because the primer is shellac based, so it seals all the wood tannins in, and I never have bleed through. So I'm just going to speed this up a little bit. I'm just going to do the same speed and technique that I did on the other drawers. I'm just going to move along here a little quicker. So now I'm going to refill my gun and get it ready for the dresser. This primer is not the cheapest, but if you can afford it, it's well worth the money. It saves a lot of time. Instead of priming 2 or 3 times, you just prime once and you move on. Really speeds up the process. And now it's ready. Now it's time to move on to sanding these edges. And unlike my last video, I'm actually going to do it correctly the first time. So, with the wood grain all flowing in the same direction, I have to take my sander and go with the wood grain on this. And I'll show you what I mean here when I get to another angle. You can't go side to side or you'll put scratches in the ends, and so we have to go with the wood grain. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. I am pulling that sander as it's running. I'm pulling it down to go with the wood grain. Now I'm doing the same thing on the other side. And I'm using 220 here because I'm trying not to take too much of that detail out of the top there. So as you can see, there's still a lot of finish still on there. The stripper dried pretty much on there, so it didn't do as good of a job on the trim. So it's going to take me a little longer to sand this off. So even though I use 220 grit with that sander, it still tends to change the shape of the trim. So I'm using a hand block and a piece of 220, and I'm going to finish this off by hand and smooth it out even more. Now we're moving on to sanding the top. So we're going to start with 120, and this will take a while. I don't remember how much time this took, and I sped it up in this video, but I believe it took me close to an hour with doing 120 and 220 on this top. It's pretty normal to go through 4 or 5 sheets of 120 when you're sanding a top, depending on how much damage there is and how much finish there is left on it. Right now I've got a lot of finish on there, as you can see, so it's going to take me a little longer to sand, but since this is solid wood, I could sand all day. So that's the only reason I left the previous finish on there. Otherwise I would have stripped this again. what I'm looking for when I'm sanding a top is how quickly the finish comes off. So I kind of go back and forth just to see how quickly it's moving. And it's doing okay here, but once your sandpaper smooths out, it just doesn't bite into the surface anymore, and that's when you know you need to change it. And just like that, it's pretty much gone. Just got a last little bit of cleanup here. And as you can see, there's that one little spot that was on the top. Still not sure if that's water or some other kind of liquid, but I'm going to try to get that out. So now I'm going to focus on that one spot. And you don't want to just set your sander on it and just sit there. You've got to keep your sander moving so you don't create a valley. So I'm mostly hitting this in a wide pattern. And at this point, I figured out this wasn't going to come out. Usually these liquid stains, they go really deep into the wood, and I think to get that out completely, I would have to do a lot more sanding, and that would take a lot more time. So I opted to leave it because I'm actually going to stain this with a very light stain, and I had a feeling it would blend in pretty well. So now I'm hitting it with 220, and that's all the sandpaper I use. I use 120 and 220. I don't throw in anything else. I think I have some 100 for certain occasions, but when it comes to a dresser top, I use 120 to get the bulk of material off, and now I'm just smoothing it up with some 220. And I like to use a dry rag and just wipe some of that excess dust off. Now we're moving on to the conditioning part of this top. So I wiped the dust off, and now I'm using the Varathane conditioner. I always use a conditioner when I'm doing this. I don't know how old this dresser is, and I don't know where it's been stored its whole life. So it's just better to condition this, and if there's any dry spots in the top, the conditioner will soak into those dry spots, and then your stain will be uniform across the whole surface. I did look into this dresser. It's a Ballman Cummings, and they were an Arkansas based company, but they went bankrupt in the 70s. So I know this dresser is at least 50 years old, but possibly more. I just thought that was interesting. So I just went over to make sure it was on evenly. Now I'm wiping off the excess, and I usually give it about an hour to dry. And these are the cloths I like to use. You could try other ones and see if they work better, but I like these the best, and so I just stick to what I like. And now we're putting on the stain, and this stain is really thin. It's called natural, and it looks like coffee to me. Basically, it's going to add a little more richness to the color on the top, and it's also going to add more definition to the wood grain. So I'm using a rag and I've wadded it up, and I'm spreading this evenly across the top. And now I'm going to hit the edges with that. It's a very thin stain, so it's not going to take too much to wipe off. And I'm just going to go in the direction of the wood grain, make sure everything is evenly laid out on the surface. Make sure you go straight across and don't make a rainbow, because that will show. So the stain has been sitting on that dresser for maybe a minute or two. You can really see the detail coming through on that wood grain. I'm just wiping in the direction of the wood grain, and so far I have not flipped my rag over. I like to use the dirty rag technique. So I'm wiping off excess, but I'm also kind of massaging some of that extra into the wood. And now I flip my rag over and I'm going to get all of the excess off. You can put the stain on and let it sit longer and allow it to penetrate the wood a little more. I don't do that because it tends to dry out on me and then it's harder to wipe off. So I prefer to just wipe on and wipe off and do as many layers as you want to get the color you want. That way it's easy to wipe off and it doesn't leave streaks. Now I'm going to strike off, so I take the rag and I tuck it in between my fingers, and then I go straight across one time, and that's it. Go perfectly straight across, go up and down on the ends of the trim, since all that wood grain goes the same direction. So while that's drying, I'm going to move on to these drawers. And I'm putting 2 layers of paint on, but I'm not going to film them both. I'm just going to show this first layer. I always do 1 layer of primer, 2 layers of paint, and then 2 layers of top coat. And then on the top of the dresser, I'll do 3 layers of top coat, just because it's a high traffic area. So you can adjust your spray gun to pretty much any setting you want. You can water down your paint to whatever viscosity you're looking for, and then you can adjust your spray gun based on how much air goes in. You can adjust the tips. There's a lot of ways you can set your spray gun. So I set mine pretty wide open, and I have my paint pretty thin, so I move quick when I am spraying. It's better to build layers of paint instead of trying to do one thick layer at one time. You just want to build thin layers on top of each other. So I've already sprayed the 2 layers of paint. Now I'm spraying my top coat on there. And I like to use lacquer on mine. I know a lot of people use polyurethane, but I just like lacquer better. It does smell a lot worse, but as far as a finish goes, I really like the way it looks. Lacquer also has the benefit of anytime you spray a layer, it reactivates the previous layers and then they all bond together. So it's also repairable if you need to. So I'm just spraying the lacquer on these drawers, and I do this twice. I'm only going to show once because I'm doing the exact same thing another time. So this is how I put on the lacquer, but I always put 2 layers on. So now those are drying, and the top of this dresser is dried. So now we're going to cover it, and we're going to get the dresser into the spray booth. So I take 12-inch paper, I cut a couple of strips, and now we're going to cover the top. And then the trick is to tuck your paper down into the tape, because you don't want the tape to touch the surface of your top. I've had cases where it's pulled stain off, or it has left residue behind and then the lacquer reacts negatively to that. So you really don't want that blue tape touching your top. You want the tape to cover the paper. And it doesn't have to look pretty, it just has to work. You have to keep a close eye and make sure that your blue tape lines up evenly under the surface. You don't want that blue tape to partially cover the front of the dresser, because when you tape that tape off, it'll show, and then you'll have to go in and do some touch-ups. It takes me about 45 minutes to paper off a dresser top, just because I have to make sure that tape is perfectly aligned. And now I'm also going to tape off the back. Believe it or not, somehow dust finds its way under there, even though I don't spray in that direction. So I just cover every possible corner. And now we're going to tape these 2 pieces together. And now this dresser is ready to go. So I'm taking these drawers out. They're done. They've dried enough. I also sanded this dresser, but I didn't have time to put that in the video. So now I'm just priming, and I just go down and then I go back up, and that's pretty much it. That gives me the coverage I'm looking for. So I gave that about an hour to dry, and now I'm ready for paint. It is nice, that primer does dry pretty quick compared to the paint. The paint takes 2 or 3 hours to dry for another coat, but the primer, it only takes maybe an hour. So I'm doing the paint the exact same way as I did the primer. I'm just going down one time, going back up one time, and that's the best way to do it for me, because I don't want any runs in this paint. If you get a run on your first layer, that's not a big deal. You can sand that out and cover it up. If you get a run on your second layer, now you're adding time to the piece because you've got to do another layer of paint. And when you add in the dry time, you're pretty much adding a few hours to this project. So I try to make sure that I don't have any runs. So I prefer to move quick when I paint, and I'll just build thin layers. So I actually did 2 layers of paint, and now it's dried, and now it's time to take the paper off. And here we'll get a sneak peek at what this is going to look like. So now it's time for lacquer, and I hold my gun a little farther back than I do the paint. This lacquer is really thin, so again, I don't want runs. I just want thin layers built on top of each other. So now I've done the whole dresser twice, and this is the third layer of lacquer going on the top. So while that's drying, I'm going to use 400 grit. I'm going to knock off any bumps on these drawers. And now we're going to unwrap them, and we're going to get the new hardware on. My wife orders all of our hardware off Amazon. I pretty much bring a dresser home, and she tells me what color we're doing and what hardware, and I'm just the worker bee. Now it's time to take the dresser out of the spray booth. I'm going to pop the drawers in. I'm going to do a light sand on the top with 400 grit, and that's it. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next one.